The wind howled through the dense forest, carrying the scent of rain and earth, as though nature itself were grieving. Among the rustling leaves and distant echoes of nocturnal creatures, a faint, broken sound emerged, a whimper. It was barely audible, lost in the chaos of the storm, but it was there, trembling and raw. The sound of something hurt, something alive. A figure trudged through the wilderness, clutching a flashlight that flickered with every step. The light barely cut through the darkness, illuminating only fragments of the forest ahead. Wet roots that jutted out like grasping fingers, clusters of undergrowth, the occasional flash of startled eyes from hidden creatures. Each step was cautious, deliberate, as if the person knew they were venturing into something far greater than just the woods. The whimper came again, louder this time, piercing through the steady drumming of raindrops on the leaves. The figure paused, the beam of the flashlight trembling slightly. For a moment, there was silence except for the rain. Then, as if summoned by the stillness, the cry returned, this time a mix of pain and desperation. Whoever, or whatever, it was close. "Hello," the voice called out, shaky but resolute. "Is someone there?" No answer came, but the sound shifted, closer, more insistent. The flashlight swept the area, revealing twisted branches and slick rocks, before finally landing on something that didn't belong. At first, it was just a shape, a lump of fur tangled in the underbrush. Then, as the light steadied, details emerged. Blood-matted fur, a slender, frail body barely clinging to life. Wide, frightened eyes that gleamed even in the dim light. It was some kind of animal. No, something more than that. Its form was almost familiar, but not quite. A creature that looked like it belonged in stories rather than reality. The figure froze, torn between fear and compassion. The creature tried to move, but its body betrayed it, collapsing back into the mud with a pitiful whine. Its legs were wrong, too long and bent in ways that seemed unnatural, as though they'd been broken or malformed. A wound ran across its side, deep and oozing, the kind of injury no wild animal could survive for long. And yet, those eyes, they weren't wild. They were intelligent, pleading, almost human in their pain. The figure dropped to their knees, setting the flashlight on a rock to free their hands. "It's okay," they whispered, unsure if the creature could even understand them. "I'm not going to hurt you." The creature flinched as the hands came closer, but it didn't fight. Maybe it couldn't, or maybe it was too desperate to care. As the rain poured down, washing away some of the blood and mud, the figure saw more of the creature's face. Sharp but delicate features, a muzzle that seemed almost too expressive, ears that drooped with exhaustion. It wasn't just wounded, it was starving, trembling with the effort to stay alive. "Who did this to you?" The figure muttered, more to themselves than to the creature. There was no collar, no sign of ownership or care. Whatever this was, it hadn't been a pet. But it wasn't entirely wild, either. Something about it was too deliberate, too unique, as though it had been created rather than born. They hesitated, knowing they were standing at a crossroads. They could leave the creature here, let nature take its course. That was the logical thing to do, wasn't it? Survival of the fittest and all that. But logic felt hollow in the face of those eyes, that silent, overwhelming plea for help. "I can't just leave you here," they said finally, as if saying it out loud would make the decision real. They reached out again, slower this time, letting the creature see and smell their hand. It didn't bite or snap, only watched, exhausted and resigned. Carefully, they slid their arms beneath its fragile body, lifting it with a gentleness that surprised even them. It was lighter than expected, as if it hadn't eaten in weeks. The creature whimpered once, a sound of pain mixed with relief, then went still, its head resting weakly against the figure's chest. For a moment, it felt like the forest itself held its breath, the storm quieting just enough to let the moment settle. The figure stood, cradling the creature as they turned back toward the faint path they'd come from. They didn't know what they were doing or even what they had found, but one thing was clear. They couldn't leave it behind. Something, somewhere, had already abandoned it. And if they didn't help, who would? But as they took their first step toward the unknown, a new sound echoed through the woods, a low, guttural growl that raised every hair on their body. They froze, the creature stirring weakly in their arms. Whatever had heard it before wasn't far away. And now, it knew where they were. The growl wasn't just a sound. It was a warning, primal and menacing. The figure felt their breath catch, their grip on the creature tightening instinctively. Their flashlight, balanced on the rock behind them, cast long, wavering shadows through the trees, but none of them explained the source of the noise. The forest suddenly felt alive in a way it hadn't before, every rustling leaf and snapping twig amplified in the tension. "Stay calm," they whispered, though whether they were talking to the creature or themselves wasn't clear. The word hung uselessly in the air, doing nothing to soften the weight of the moment. The growl came again, this time closer, deeper, vibrating in their chest like a storm rolling in. They scanned the darkness, their eyes darting between the trees, but the flashlight didn't reach far enough. The creature stirred weakly in their arms, a soft whimper escaping its throat as if it, too, could sense the danger closing in. Its fragile body was trembling, whether from fear, pain, or exhaustion. They couldn't tell. Whatever was out there wasn't going to give them the time to figure it out. The figure took a step back, their boots squelching in the mud. Then another, their mind racing. Running wasn't an option, not while carrying the creature, not on this uneven ground. But standing still felt like an invitation to whatever was watching. Then, just on the edge of the flashlight's beam, something moved. A shadow, low to the ground, slinking between the trees with unsettling grace. It didn't look like a wolf or a bear, but something in its movements felt deliberate, intelligent. The figure's voice shook as they called out, "I don't want any trouble." The words felt laughably small against the presence in the dark. The creature in their arms shifted again, its weak breaths quickening, and for a split second, the figure thought it might cry out. They adjusted their hold, whispering a soft, "Shh, it's okay," even though nothing about the situation felt okay. The shadow stepped closer, and now they could see it, or part of it. Gleaming eyes, too high and too focused for any animal they knew. A flash of something metallic glinted in the light, maybe teeth or claws. Whatever it was watching them with purpose. The figure's pulse hammered in their ears as they took another step back, their foot catching on a root. They stumbled but didn't fall, the creature letting out a soft cry at the jolt. The sound seemed to snap something in the air, breaking the heavy stillness. The shadow lunged. The figure turned and ran. It wasn't a conscious decision, more instinct than thought. Their legs moved before their brain could argue, the flashlight forgotten on the rock as they plunged into the darkness. The creature in their arms clung weakly to their chest, its trembling growing worse with every jarring step. Branches whipped at their face and arms, mud slick underfoot, but they didn't dare stop. Behind them, the growling turned into snarls, the sound of something massive crashing through the underbrush in pursuit. "Just hold on," they panted, not sure if they were talking to the creature or themselves. The trees blurred around them, the storm now a distant roar compared to the pounding of their own heartbeat. Suddenly, their foot caught on something, a rock or a root, they didn't know. And they went down hard, the air knocked from their lungs as they hit the ground. Pain flared in their shoulder, but they didn't have time to register it fully. They scrambled to shield the creature with their body as they rolled, mud and leaves clinging to their clothes. The growling stopped. For a moment, there was only the sound of their own ragged breathing and the patter of rain on the canopy above. They dared to look up, their eyes scanning the shadows, expecting to see the gleaming eyes and the metallic flash again. But the forest was still, too still. The creature whimpered in their arms, its eyes half-lidded now, its strength fading fast. They couldn't stay here. Whatever had been chasing them wasn't gone. It was waiting, watching, biding its time. Gritting their teeth, they pushed themselves to their feet, ignoring the sharp protest from their shoulder. They adjusted their grip on the creature and pressed forward, each step feeling heavier than the last. They didn't know where they were going, just away. Away from the growling, the shadows, the sense that the forest itself was against them. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. It was impossible to tell. The rain had eased to a drizzle, but the air was still heavy, clinging to them like a second skin. The figure's legs burned, their breath coming in shallow gasps, but they couldn't stop. Not yet. Finally, through the thinning trees, they saw it, a faint golden glow. At first, they thought it was a trick of their exhausted mind, but as they moved closer, the light grew steadier, brighter. A cabin, small and weathered, but unmistakably human. Relief surged through them, giving them the strength to close the distance. The creature in their arms was barely conscious now, its breathing shallow and uneven. They stumbled up the short steps to the porch, their free hand slamming against the door. "Hello," they called, their voice hoarse. "Is anyone here? Please." For a moment, there was no answer, and panic set in. They banged on the door again, harder this time, desperation seeping into their voice. "Please, I need help." The sound of a lock turning was the most beautiful thing they'd heard all night. The door creaked open just wide enough to reveal an older man, his face lined with age and suspicion. He held a lantern in one hand, its glow illuminating his sharp, assessing eyes. "What in the—" he started, his gaze dropping to the creature in their arms. Whatever he saw made him step back, his expression shifting from suspicion to something closer to fear. "Please," the figure said again, their legs threatening to give out. "It's hurt. I don't know what it is, but it needs help. We both do." The man hesitated, his eyes darting to the darkness behind them, as if expecting something to emerge from the woods. Finally, he stepped aside, gesturing them in. "Get in." "Quickly," he said, his voice low and urgent. The figure didn't need to be told twice. They slipped inside, the door closing with a heavy thud behind them. The man locked it immediately, sliding a thick wooden bar into place before turning to face them. "Do you have any idea what you've brought here?" he asked, his voice grim. The figure shook their head, sinking to the floor as their legs finally gave out. "No," they admitted, looking down at the creature. "But I couldn't just leave it." The man didn't respond right away, his gaze lingering on the creature with a mixture of wariness and something else, something almost like recognition. "You've got no idea what you've stepped into," he said finally, his voice almost a whisper. Outside, the growl came again, this time so close it seemed to rattle the walls. The growl outside sent a cold chill rippling through the room. The figure's breath caught, their arms tightening protectively around the creature. It stirred faintly, letting out a feeble whimper, its body too broken to do more. The older man moved swiftly, extinguishing the lantern and plunging the small cabin into darkness. Only the faint glow of embers in a stone fireplace remained, casting flickering shadows across the walls. "Stay quiet," the man whispered, his voice barely audible. He crouched by a window, peering through a crack in the wooden shutters. His face was tense, his eyes scanning the tree line beyond. "It's still out there." The figure's pulse thundered in their ears. "What asterisk is asterisk it?" They asked in a low voice, barely daring to speak. "What's chasing us?" The man glanced back at them, his expression grim. "Not something you'd ever want to meet, and certainly not something you'd want to lead to my door." His tone was sharp, but beneath it was a trace of fear that made the figure's stomach churn. "I didn't have a choice," they whispered. "I couldn't leave it out there. It would have died." "Maybe it should have," the man muttered under his breath. But before the figure could respond, the sound came again. A snarl, deep and guttural, closer now. The walls of the cabin seemed to shudder with its force. The older man cursed under his breath. He grabbed a rusted rifle leaning against the wall, and checked it with practiced hands. It's not going to stop. Not until it gets what it came for. And what is that? The figure asked, their voice trembling. The man didn't answer. Instead, he crossed the room in 3 quick strides and knelt in front of them, his eyes locking onto the creature in their arms. He studied it for a long moment, his face a mix of fear and something else, an emotion that the figure couldn't quite name. "Where did you find it?" he asked finally. "Out in the woods," the figure replied. "It was hurt, bleeding. I couldn't just leave it there." The man shook his head, his grip tightening on the rifle. "You don't understand what you've brought here. That thing in your arms, it's not an animal. It's not even close." The figure frowned, looking down at the creature. Its breathing was shallow now, its eyes half-lidded but still glowing faintly in the dim light. "What do you mean? What is it then?" The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned back to the window, his shoulders tense. "It's a survivor," he said at last, "from something most people wouldn't believe if they saw it with their own eyes. And whatever did that to it," he gestured to the creature's wounds, "isn't going to stop until it finishes the job." The figure's grip on the creature tightened. "You're saying it's after this asterisk, that thing outside?" The man nodded. "And now it knows we're in here, which means we're out of time." As if on cue, a loud, scraping noise echoed from outside, the sound of claws dragging against wood. The figure's heart leaped into their throat as they realized it was coming from the porch. The creature whimpered again, its body trembling with a fear that felt almost human. The older man moved to the door, pressing his back against it, as if that alone could hold back whatever was outside. He raised the rifle, his knuckles white around the stock. "It's testing us," he muttered, "trying to find a way in." "What do we do?" the figure asked, their voice cracking. They felt utterly powerless, trapped in a situation they didn't understand with no way out. The man didn't answer right away. His eyes were fixed on the door, his breath steady but shallow. Finally, he said, "If we're lucky, it'll lose interest. If we're not." The scraping stopped. For a moment, there was silence, so heavy it pressed down on them like a weight. Then came the sound of something circling the cabin, slow, deliberate footsteps that made the wooden floorboards creak with every pass. The figure clutched the creature tighter, their mind racing. "There has to be something we can do," they said, desperation creeping into their voice. The man didn't respond. His focus was entirely on the door, his finger hovering over the trigger of the rifle. Whatever was outside was smart. Too smart. It wasn't just attacking blindly. It was hunting, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Then, without warning, the footsteps stopped. The figure held their breath, their ears straining against the silence. Seconds passed, each one stretching into an eternity. Finally, they dared to whisper, "Is it gone?" Before the man could answer, the cabin shook violently, the door splintering as something massive slammed against it. The man staggered back, raising the rifle and firing a shot that deafened the room. The creature in the figure's arms let out a sharp cry, its fragile body trembling, as the sound echoed in the confined space. The door held, but barely. The wood was cracked and buckling, and outside, the growling turned into a furious roar. The man reloaded the rifle with shaking hands, his face pale. "That won't hold much longer," he said through gritted teeth. "If you've got any bright ideas, now's the time." The figure looked around the cabin, their mind racing. There had to be something, some way to buy them more time. But all they saw were the bare essentials of survival. A table, a few chairs, the smoldering remains of the fire. Nothing that could stop whatever was outside. And then their eyes fell on the creature. It was watching them now, its glowing eyes filled with something that looked almost like understanding. It shifted weakly in their arms, letting out a low, mournful sound. The figure didn't know how they knew, but they felt it deep in their gut. The creature had the answer. Whatever it was, whatever it had survived, it wasn't helpless. It had a strength they couldn't see, something that had kept it alive this long. They just had to trust it. The creature shifted again, its trembling intensifying. The figure felt its heartbeat, faint and erratic, pulsing against their arms. Those glowing eyes locked onto theirs, and for a moment, everything else, the roar outside, the splintering wood, the older man's frantic movements, seemed to fall away. There was a message in that gaze, something unspoken but urgent, as though the creature was trying to convey something critical. The older man's voice cut through the haze. "What are you doing? We don't have time to." His words were drowned out by another thunderous impact against the door. The wood groaned, and a jagged crack ran down its center. "We're out of options." The figure looked up sharply. "No, we're not." Their voice was steadier than they felt, but they didn't let doubt creep in. "It knows something. I can feel it." The man shot them a look of disbelief. "It's half dead. Whatever you think it's going to do, it's not worth betting our lives on." But the figure didn't waver. They knelt, gently laying the creature on the floor. It let out a soft whine but didn't resist, its glowing eyes still fixed on them. "You've been fighting this thing for longer than I have," they said, their voice firm but quiet. "But you didn't bring it down, and your rifle isn't going to stop it now. Maybe this is our only chance." The man opened his mouth to argue, but another crash shook the room, cutting him off. The door splintered further, and through the cracks, they could see it, a massive shape, its eyes gleaming like twin embers in the darkness. Its growl was a low, rumbling threat, the sound of something that knew it had already won. The figure turned back to the creature. "I don't know what you are," they whispered, "but if you've got any fight left in you, now's the time to use it." The creature blinked slowly, its gaze heavy with exhaustion. But then, to the figure's astonishment, it began to move. Its frail body stretched and shuddered, as though something deep inside it had been stirred awake. The older man took a step back, his grip on the rifle tightening. "What's it doing?" he asked, his voice barely audible. The figure didn't answer. They couldn't. They were too transfixed by what was unfolding in front of them. The creature's wounds seemed to pulse faintly, the edges of its injuries glowing with the same strange light as its eyes. Its trembling slowed, replaced by a steady rhythmic movement, as though it were gathering strength from some unseen source. And then the growling outside stopped. The silence was so sudden and complete that it felt unnatural, as though the entire forest had paused to watch. Even the older man froze, his eyes darting toward the door. "That's not good," he muttered. Before anyone could react, the door exploded inward, a massive form charging through the splintered wood with terrifying speed. The creature outside was like nothing the figure had ever seen, its body hulking and shadowy, its form constantly shifting as though it didn't belong to this world. Its eyes burned with a feral intelligence, and its teeth gleamed like jagged shards of metal. It let out a roar that rattled the very air, a sound of rage and hunger that seemed to pierce straight through them. The older man fired, the rifle's crack deafening in the confined space. The shot hit its mark, slamming into the creature's shoulder, but it barely flinched. It turned its gaze toward the man, and for the first time, he looked genuinely afraid. The figure moved instinctively, positioning themselves between the creature and the small, glowing form on the floor. But they didn't have to. The creature they had rescued was no longer lying helpless. It rose shakily to its feet, its frail form straightening as the glow around its wounds intensified. Its eyes burned brighter, locking onto the intruder with a resolve that was almost palpable. The hulking creature hesitated, its massive form shrinking back slightly as though it could sense the shift in power. The older man noticed it too. "What's happening?" he asked, his voice tinged with awe and fear. "I don't know," the figure replied, their heart pounding. "But I think it's fighting back." The rescued creature let out a sound, a low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate through the air. It wasn't a growl or a cry of pain, but something else entirely. The air around it shimmered, bending and warping as though reality itself were shifting in response. The intruder roared, lunging forward, but the smaller creature moved faster than seemed possible. In a blur of light and motion, it struck, its frail-looking form colliding with the hulking beast with a force that shook the ground. The figure stumbled back, shielding their eyes as a blinding light filled the cabin. The older man cursed, dropping the rifle as he covered his face. The roar of the larger creature turned into a high-pitched wail, a sound of agony and fury that made the walls vibrate. When the light faded, the figure opened their eyes cautiously. The intruder was gone, its massive form reduced to nothing more than a faint, shimmering mist that dissipated into the air. The smaller creature stood in the center of the room, its glowing eyes still fixed on the spot where its enemy had been. For a moment, everything was still. Then the creature's legs buckled, and it collapsed to the floor, the glow around it fading rapidly. The figure rushed to its side, their hands trembling as they touched its fur. It was alive, barely. But whatever strength it had summoned was gone. The older man stared at the scene, his face pale. "What just happened?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," the figure replied, their own voice shaking. "But I think it just saved us." The man shook his head, disbelief written all over his face. "You don't understand. If it can do that, then whatever was after it isn't the worst thing out there." He paused, his gaze darkening. "You've just opened a door to something much bigger." The air in the cabin was thick with tension, the silence oppressive. The figure cradled the creature, its breathing faint but steady. Outside, the shattered remains of the door swung limply on its hinges, the wind carrying with it a cold that seemed unnatural. The older man stood motionless, his rifle forgotten at his feet, his face pale and unreadable. For a moment, it felt like it was over. The hulking intruder was gone, and the small creature's fierce display had left no doubt about its power. But the man's words lingered in the air, heavy with a warning the figure didn't fully understand. They looked at him, their voice breaking the silence. "What do you mean, something bigger?" The man didn't respond immediately. His gaze drifted to the glowing creature, his expression a mix of fear and something that resembled reverence. "That thing you saved," he said finally, his voice low, "isn't just running from predators. It's running from its own kind." The figure frowned, confusion knitting their brow. "What are you talking about? Its own kind? Why would they?" Before they could finish, a sound cut through the night, a low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate through the very earth. It was faint at first, distant, but it grew louder, stronger, until it was almost deafening. The older man stiffened, his eyes snapping to the broken door. "You hear that?" he asked, his voice barely audible. The figure nodded, their stomach twisting with unease. The sound wasn't just loud, it felt alive, pressing against them like an unseen force. The creature in their arms stirred weakly, letting out a soft, mournful cry that sent a shiver down their spine. And then they saw it. Through the broken doorway, the trees in the distance began to sway violently, as though a massive storm were sweeping through the forest. But there was no wind. The air was eerily still, the only movement coming from the unnatural rippling of the treetops. The older man cursed under his breath, grabbing the rifle and backing away from the door. "I told you," he muttered, his voice trembling. "I told you it wasn't over." Before the figure could respond, the hum grew louder, and a shape emerged from the forest. It wasn't like the creature they'd just faced. This was something far worse. It moved with an unnatural fluidity, its body shimmering like liquid metal, constantly shifting and reforming. Its size dwarfed the cabin, and its glowing eyes burned with a cold, unrelenting light. The figure felt their breath catch. This wasn't a predator. This was a force of nature, something far beyond their understanding. They tightened their grip on the small creature, instinctively shielding it, even though they knew it was futile. "What is that?" they whispered. The older man didn't answer. He simply raised the rifle, his hands shaking. But before he could fire, the shimmering entity stopped, its gaze fixed on the glowing creature in the figure's arms. For a moment, it didn't move, its form rippling as though it were assessing the situation. Then it spoke. Its voice wasn't a sound so much as a presence, a deep, resonant vibration that seemed to echo inside their minds. Asterisk, you cannot keep it. It belongs to us. Asterisk. The figure's heart pounded. They glanced down at the creature, its faint glow flickering like a dying ember. It's not yours, they said, their voice trembling but resolute. It doesn't want to go with you. The entity's form shifted, its edges hardening into sharp, jagged lines. Asterisk, it does not matter what it wants. It is bound. Return it, or you will suffer the consequences. Asterisk. The older man took a step forward, his voice sharp. We didn't go through all this just to hand it over to something like you. If you want it, you'll have to go through us. The entity tilted its head, the movement unnervingly human. Asterisk. You misunderstand. It is not a choice. It is an inevitability. Asterisk. And then it moved. It was faster than anything the figure had ever seen, closing the distance to the cabin in the blink of an eye. The older man fired, the rifle's report echoing through the room, but the shot passed through the entity harmlessly, its form rippling as though it were made of smoke. The figure scrambled backward, clutching the creature tightly as the entity loomed over them. Its light grew brighter, filling the room with a blinding radiance. But just as it reached for the small glowing form, something unexpected happened. The creature opened its eyes. The glow that had flickered so faintly before now burst forth with an intensity that rivaled the entity's own light. The figure felt a surge of heat as the creature's body began to levitate, slipping from their grasp as it rose into the air. Its form straightened, its wounds healing in an instant, and when it looked at the entity, its eyes burned with a fierce, unyielding light. The entity recoiled, its form twisting in apparent confusion. Asterisk, you can it. Asterisk, it began, but the creature cut it off with a sound, a sharp, resonant cry that seemed to shake the very foundation of the cabin. The entity staggered, its form flickering as though it were struggling to maintain its shape. The creature's glow intensified, and the air around it seemed to ripple with raw energy. The figure and the older man could only watch in stunned silence as the creature unleashed a surge of light that consumed the entity completely. When the light faded, the entity was gone. The creature hovered in the air for a moment longer, its glow softening, before it gently descended back to the floor. It looked at the figure, its gaze calm but wary, and for the first time, they saw something in its eyes that they hadn't noticed before: gratitude. The older man let out a shaky breath, lowering the rifle. What just happened? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The figure shook their head, their own thoughts a whirlwind. I don't know, they said, but I think it chose to fight back. The creature moved closer to them, nuzzling their hand briefly before stepping away. It turned toward the broken doorway, its glowing eyes scanning the forest beyond. Then, without a sound, it began to walk, its form fading until it was nothing more than a faint light disappearing into the trees. The figure watched it go, a strange mix of emotions welling up inside them. Relief, sadness, awe. They turned to the older man, who was still staring at the empty doorway. Do you think it'll be okay? They asked. He didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. I think it's stronger than we gave it credit for. But whatever's out there, it's not finished. The figure nodded, their gaze lingering on the forest. The danger was gone, for now. But they couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something far bigger than they could comprehend. The night stretched on in heavy silence after the creature vanished into the forest, its faint glow swallowed by the darkness. The figure and the older man stood in the shattered remains of the cabin, the tension in the air slowly easing but never fully dissipating. It was over, but the echoes of what had just happened lingered, pressing against their thoughts like a weight that refused to lift. The figure finally turned away from the doorway, their gaze falling to the mess inside the cabin. The splintered wood, the overturned furniture, and the faint scorch marks on the floor where the creature's light had burned the brightest. "What now?" they asked quietly, their voice breaking the stillness. The older man sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. He looked tired, more than tired, worn down. "Now," he echoed, "now we try to make sense of it. If that's even possible." They both knew it wasn't. What they had witnessed defied logic, the kind of thing that would haunt their memories, but never find a place in the world of reason. The figure moved to one of the unbroken chairs, sitting heavily as the adrenaline that had kept them going began to fade. Their body ached, and their mind was a chaotic swirl of questions that had no answers. "Do you think it'll come back?" they asked after a long pause, their gaze fixed on the doorway. The man hesitated, his eyes narrowing as he considered the question. "Not the creature we saved," he said finally. "But something else might. Things like that. They don't just disappear. And if there's one, there's bound to be more." The figure's stomach twisted at the thought. They had hoped, foolishly, that this was an isolated event, a one-time brush with something extraordinary and terrifying. But deep down, they knew he was right. The glowing creature's appearance, its battle, and the entity that had pursued it were not the end of the story. They were a part of something much larger, something that had only brushed the edges of their lives. The older man began to gather his things, his movements slow and deliberate. The rifle was slung over his shoulder, and he carefully picked through the debris for anything salvageable. The figure watched him, their curiosity breaking through the haze of exhaustion. "Why were you out here?" they asked. "Before all this, you didn't just stumble into this, did you?" The man paused, his back to them, before letting out a dry chuckle. "No," he admitted. "I didn't stumble into anything. I came looking for the creature." They pressed, sitting up straighter. He turned to face them, his expression guarded. "Not for it, specifically, but for something like it. I've been tracking anomalies for years. Strange sightings, unexplained events. Most of it turns out to be nothing. Wild animals, overactive imaginations. But every so often, you find something real, something that doesn't belong." The figure's eyes widened slightly. "And this, was it what you were looking for?" The man shook his head, his expression grim. "No, it was more than I bargained for." There was a weight to his words that made the figure shiver. They thought about the glowing creature, its pain, its resilience, and the way it had looked at them with an intelligence that was both alien and deeply familiar. "What happens if more of them show up?" they asked quietly. The man didn't answer right away. He finished packing up his things, then straightened, his gaze meeting theirs. "If more show up," he said slowly, "you'll have to make a choice, just like you did tonight. And you'll have to live with the consequences." The figure frowned. But before they could respond, he moved toward the door, stepping carefully over the broken wood. He paused in the doorway, glancing back over his shoulder. "I don't know what you're planning to do," he said, "but if you stay here, you'd better be ready. Because this was just the beginning." With that, he was gone, his silhouette fading into the night. The figure sat in silence, his words replaying in their mind. The beginning. It felt ominous, but also strangely hopeful, as if there was a purpose to what had happened, even if they couldn't see it yet. They stayed in the cabin until the first light of dawn broke through the trees, casting long shadows over the forest floor. The warmth of the sun felt like a reassurance, a reminder that the world still turned, even after a night like this. They stood slowly, their muscles stiff, and walked to the doorway. The forest was quiet again, peaceful in a way that made the events of the night feel almost unreal. Almost. The figure's gaze drifted to the spot where the glowing creature had disappeared. They didn't know where it had gone, or if they would ever see it again. But they hoped, no, they believed, that it was safe. It had chosen to fight, to survive. And in doing so, It had given them something they couldn't quite put into words. A sense of connection. A glimpse of something greater. As they turned to leave the cabin, a faint glimmer caught their eye. On the forest floor, just beyond the broken doorway, lay a small glowing shard. It was no bigger than a pebble, its light soft and pulsing gently, like a heartbeat. The figure knelt, picking it up carefully. The warmth of it spread through their fingers, and for a moment, they thought they could hear a faint hum, almost like the creature's voice. They slipped the shard into their pocket, a small smile tugging at the corners of their lips. Whatever came next, they would face it. They didn't know what the future held, but they weren't afraid. Because somewhere out there, in the vastness of the unknown, was proof that even in the face of unimaginable darkness, there was light. And that was enough. For now.